Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. 21st of June. Outsiders about to commence.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not. And hooray for them. Our outsiders this morning are Nicholas Rees, Principal Fellow at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He used to be a Director of Strategy of the PM's office, Julie Gillard, and Deputy Chief of Staff and Head of Policy for Premiers Brax and Brumby. There's your CV, Nicholas, on a little page.
Good to be with you, Jonathan.
James Patterson's also here, Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, as is Stephanie Convery. She's Deputy Editor at Overland magazine, freelance writer, and has never worked for the Institute of Public Affairs.
No, I have not. That is very true.
Which, James, makes her a rarity in Australian public life.
Well, yes, as I said, there's still time for Stephanie yet.
Now, we've all, at risk of our own audience, been glued to Insiders this morning, where Barry Cassidy has an interview with Bill Shorten, the opposition leader. It's been something of a week for Mr. Shorten, the PM sort of taking out the long handle yesterday.
We saw a lot of merging in a Royal Commission in Melbourne. And we saw the Labor Party getting deeper and deeper into a crisis, an existential crisis over what it really believes and who it really stands for. Because when senior union officials dud their workers to boost their power, they are saying that they are more important than the workers that they are supposed to represent.
Is there an existential crisis in Labor, Nicholas Rees?
No, I don't think there is. Obviously, the affairs of the union movement are being trawled over by the Royal Commission, and look, there are some aspects that come to light which are not favourable. I think that's very correct to say. But certainly in Bill Shorten's case, I think that he's a guy who had a 20-year track record in the union movement, which was a very positive one. I mean, he got to the top of the union movement by being good at what he did, and that was getting good deals in workplaces for workers.
And Stephanie Convery, how do you feel when you hear the detail of those deals, and we hear of a union like the AWU making arrangements with major employers, getting what look like payments in consideration for those deals, and the conditions of those workers perhaps not being the best they could be in those deals?
Yeah, look, I think that's pretty problematic, and I think Shorten knows that, and I think the Liberal Party knows that too, which is why they're capitalising on it now. I mean, I think it's pretty rich of the Prime Minister, whose track record on workers is not great either, making comments about it, but I think they're deliberately trying to destabilise Shorten's leadership, and that's what we're seeing happening now.
It's slightly weird, isn't it, James Patterson? I mean, we organisations like yours, for example, would be full of praise for unions which make these sorts of arrangements, which expedite projects, which are the picture of moderation, and yet here we have a Labor leader being hauled over the coals for just that behaviour.
Well, Jonathan, not just these sorts of agreements, but this specific agreement, in fact, the IPA published an analysis of based on publicly available information in 2005 on this deal and praised it because it was a very sensible deal. It allowed the project to be built ahead of time, ahead of schedule, saved the company a lot of money.
Now, this is the Eastlink deal with John Holland and the AWU.
Correct, and compared it to the CityLink deal, which is a bit of a disaster. In fact, I have to say, though, my heart doesn't bleed too much for the workers on this deal. Ewan Hannon, the editor of the Workplace Relations at the Australian Financial Review, tweeted this week that a base grade labourer in 2005 on this project earned $150,000 a year. A carpenter earned $160,000 to $170,000 a year, and a crane driver earned $200,000 a year. So I don't think these workers were too hard done by. We didn't know at the time, of course, that there might have been payments by the company to the union as part of the deal. That was unknown at the time, but it was a good, moderate, reasonable deal.
So it seems that Bill Shorten and the Australian Workers' Union, and the union he led at the time, are being criticised by at least the Abbott government for not being the CFMEU. I mean, they did do some trade-offs to get those fantastic pay rates. Some of the RDOs the number of RDOs
Mm-hmm.
was reduced. That gave the construction company greater certainty over the delivery timetable on the project, which was something that they highly valued, and that flowed through to higher wages and better conditions for the workers. So it was a win-win scenario.
Is it a win-win, Stephanie? I mean, where do the workers sit in this? And we have this sort of collusive behaviour, I guess, between big unions, big employers. Is that at the expense of the worker interest?
I think it can't help but be at the expense of the workers' interests. I mean, look, it's well known throughout the union movement that union bureaucracy can be really problematic for workers because workers' interests are not represented by their union officials when the union officials have their own interests at heart. Having said that, I'm all for unions, and I think that they should be stronger, and I think that they should be better in touch with their workers to know what's better for them.
Piers Ackerman writes today in the Sunday Telegraph, and I think this is an interesting one, Nicholas. He says, all the evidence suggests that Shorten, as a union boss, actually went harder and earlier than Coalition Prime Minister John Howard did when he introduced his greatly vilified program of industrial reform, Work Choices, in 2005. It's getting a bit weird, isn't it?
Look, my head's spinning trying to compute exactly where Piers is coming from here. I mean, we know what his objective must be. It'll be to try and harm Bill Shorten and inflict maximum damage on Labor. That will be his objective in writing that piece. So I'm assuming that's some sort of slur on Bill Shorten, trying to say he's been even worse for workers than the Liberal government. Of course, that's not true. I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, he's got a pretty amazing track record as a union leader and getting good outcomes on hundreds and hundreds of deals.
And yet, James, we're spending 80 million here on a Royal Commission, which is basically about stitching up the likes of Shorten, isn't it?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I mean, we've had serious documented cases of corruption. The Health Services Union is the best example, where
Which
workers
has had
have
its
been
own legal process.
incredibly poorly served by the union movement and by the union movement's relationship with the Labor Party. Now, I'm not actually one of those people on the right who thinks that Labor is badly served by having unions in them. I think actually unions are one of the only moderating forces anchoring the Labor Party to the centre of Australian politics. But I actually think it's bad for unions to be in the Labor Party because it creates incentives for union leaders to pump up their membership at the cost of the members' rights, because they're involved in a political party and every extra member in a union means an extra vote in the Labor Party. When you link union member numbers to influence in the ALP, it is inevitable that these sorts of deals will happen.
James, Stephanie mentions the HSU matter, which was the subject of court proceedings. There was there were the allegations made, there were charges or claims made which were tested in court. Why do we need a Royal Commission as another layer above that?
Look, I don't know. I think in this case anyway, the Royal Commission is a very, very useful for the Abbott government to draw a rift between the party base of the Labor Party base and the leader of the Labor Party, and I think that's what we're seeing playing out now. I think whatever truth there is to the corruption in union bureaucracies, and I am certainly willing to believe that there is, I think that this is a really political intervention into the workings of the Labor Party.
It's hard, isn't it, James, not to see it as pure politics?
Well, I mean, you can choose to see it that way, but things can be both political and worthy at the same time. And I don't
Give
think
me an example of that.
Well, I don't think the government was going after Bill Shorten and thinking that there was some dodgy deal in Shorten's past that they would uncover with this process. What they called the inquiry in response to was the considerable widespread public concern about corruption in the union movement, and in particular unions like the Health Services Union, and also the militant nature of unions like the CFMEU and their now disclosed links with underworld crime figures and bikie gangs. I mean, these are very serious allegations that deserve to be examined, and frankly, the existing legal system and political system has failed to deal with them. Police have failed to enforce the law on a lot of these disputes and a lot of these issues.
Stephanie, you're not looking impressed by that.
Oh, look, I think that the word militancy is often thrown around about unions as necessarily a bad thing. But you know what? Workers have to band together in order to have their rights recognised by employers, and that's been a long and hard road for many, many workers. So I think to call them militant and say that that's bad is again hugely problematic.
It's interesting. I mean, the CFMEU would wear the badge of militant as a badge of pride. They are overtly militant. They say that, but then they also say, well, we've got a fantastic proposition for our members. Look at the deals we get. Look at the paying conditions we're able to win on your behalf. So it's funny, they wear that as a badge of pride. James brings up a good point, though. I mean, I do remember when this Royal Commission was announced, it was meant to be all about corruption and bikie gangs, and we sort of haven't been hearing so much about the bikie gangs lately. It all seems to now be about the inner workings of the Labor Party, which I think is confirming the suspicions of many that really this was a political exercise being run by politicians. You see Liberal politicians in the media every day stoking the fire, making it all about trying to attack the Labor Party, not necessarily about the state of the Labor movement in this country, as in the union movement.
Nick, do you think it would be better if we didn't know this week that TEAS had been making these payments to AWU? Do you think the Australian people don't deserve to know that these arrangements were taking place? It should have been kept quiet.
No, my point is simply that Australian taxpayers have spent upwards of $80 million on a Royal Commission, which I think it could be strongly argued those investigations could have occurred with existing organs of government, things like the Industrial Relations Commission, or in some cases potentially the police. I don't know we needed to spend an extra $80 million of taxpayers' money to go on what has clearly been a political exercise.
But the point is that none of those bodies have uncovered this before. It took a Royal Commission to uncover these facts.
A Industrial Relations Commission charged with the responsibility of investigating these matters could have got to the bottom of them, I would posit.
Now, the whole role of things like courts and politics has been very much top of mind this week. This is what we won't throw to our outsiders now: Nicholas Rees, James Patterson, Stephanie Convery. We've had this conversation in politics about citizenship. We're going to see legislation this week, which is likely to give the Minister for Immigration the possibility of withdrawing people's citizenship. Opposition Leader Bill Shorten in Parliament was quizzing the PM over the process around the framing of this law.
Prime Minister, who has actually seen the government's proposed citizenship legislation?
I call the Honourable Prime Minister.
The relevant ministers.
Is that good enough, Stephanie Convery? That assurance? Are you impressed by the process here around this new law?
I'm not impressed by only two other people in the cabinet having seen it. No, of course not. Also, I think the real issue here is the fact that the proposal being put forward by Abbott and co is completely bypassing rule of law. It's completely bypassing the right to a fair trial. I think the entire idea that a single minister can arbitrarily cancel a person's citizenship, regardless of whether they have a citizenship to another country or they can apply for citizenship to another country, is just abominable. The fact that we can convict somebody of a crime without actually having a conviction is effectively what's going on.
PM James Patterson seems to be suggesting that the courts would find loopholes for terrorists in these sorts of cases, that courts would be an easy way out, that's an imperfect method of bringing these sorts of actions. Does that satisfy you? I mean, that seems to be dangerous territory.
Well, not adequately. I mean, it is reasonable to take steps to make it more easy to take citizenship away from people who take up arms against Australia. I do support that, but it has to follow the appropriate process. And from what has been public so far, I'm not sufficiently comforted that
what would be that
case.
appropriate process?
Well, only a court, in my view, should have the power to take away someone's citizenship. It should never rest in the power of a minister. And if it had to rest for some reason in the power of the minister, it would have to be fully reviewable, not by the courts, not partially reviewable by the courts, as has been suggested. I mean, we live in a country that has the separation of the judiciary and the executive for a reason, separation of the parliament from the executive, and throwing that away because we want to go after a small group of people is a very dangerous thing in my view.
This goes a bit beyond this specific issue, doesn't it, Nicholas Rees? I mean, this is, as James suggests there, a very important fundamental principle.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the separation of powers is enshrined in our constitution, hence why constitutional law.
All that in a bag of potato chips, but we're approaching the upload limit, so here endeth this movie, and I will return as soon as possible.